Greetings everyone, welcome to another crash course in music history. Today we're going to be looking at Baroque in the 18th century. We're going to be skipping over two very important composers because I want to give a whole presentation time to them. So as you're thinking about your presentation, you don't need to necessarily have all of your composers or songs. You don't need to have it picked out for the Baroque era yet because we aren't going to talk about Bach and we're not going to talk about Handel today, both of which are very important composers. So next week is when you might want to make your final selection about which piece you're going to include on your program from the Baroque era. But if you want to start this week, that's totally fine. I just want to let you know we're not going to cover those two composers today, but we're going to cover just a little bit more information today, and it's going to be short because I want you to do some more listening. All right, here we go. So, we are in the 18th century now, that's the 1700s, and one thing I want you to be aware of about this era, opera at this time, the lead parts were written for male castrati. Now, what that means, if you were a castrato, it means you were a castrated man, and usually, well not usually, this would have happened to these gentlemen as young boys with the hope that they would become famous singers. And what happens when that surgery takes place is these young boys grow up to have the bodies of men and the full lung capacity of men, but their voices never develop. They retain their small childlike vocal folds, which means they can sing these really beautiful high parts, very much like a lady, but with the lung capacity and physical mechanisms of a man. And unfortunately, this was fairly common in this era, so much so that, like I say, a lot of the lead opera roles were written for castrati. One of the most famous of these was a man by the name of Carlo Broschi, which that's just a great last name, but you might recognize the name he more commonly went by, his stage name, because I've mentioned it before in choir, Farinelli. You know that breathing exercise we do in choir where we turn to the side and we raise our hands while breathing in, pant, and that exercise. So this is an exercise he did. This was a man that was adored throughout Europe, Italian, could sing high C's, like the soprano high C's. He was purported to be able to carry phrases on a single breath that were over a minute long. And there's a great story of him out-singing a trumpet player during a performance. Just a very, very talented man. Today, when these songs from this era are redone, they're usually sung by countertenors. Now, a countertenor, just so you know, is a regular tenor that sings in head voice or falsetto. There's an example of this I'd like you to listen to. It's a modern recording sung by a countertenor. There are not castrati anymore. That became illegal in the late 19th century, and the last castrati died in the very early 20th century. And he's about the only one we have a recording of. So, yay, that's illegal now. Of course, it was kind of sketchy back then too, but it's definitely legal now. Anyways, not the point. Point is, I want you to listen to the example that I have on here. It's a song from Handel's opera, Giulio Cesare, Julius Caesar, and it's sung by a countertenor. You don't need to listen to a lot of it, but just take a listen so you can hear what this role sounds like. It's a male voice singing what's really a lady's part. And there's some modern productions that use ladies to sing it, but this is done by a male. So take a listen and then come back. Alright, so we are going to talk about one really important composer today, an Italian composer from the Baroque era, Antonio Vivaldi, a master violinist, an Italian composer, also an ordained minister, a redhead who was known as the Red Priest. He's wearing a wig in this painting, as was very common at the time. He taught music for many years at a home for orphaned or poor children, where music instruction was provided for them. And this was actually something that was fairly common in Italy. These were originally called conservatories, which of course now that term refers to music schools. But at the time this referred to a home for poor or orphaned children, and a lot of them thought it was important to provide them with music instruction. And so Mr. Vivaldi worked at one of these. He wrote music for the kids to perform, and over his life he wrote 49 operas, 500 concertos, and remember, concerto is a symphonic work that also features solo instrument or instruments, and a lot of other works. He earned a lot of money doing this, and he spent a lot of money, and he died pretty much broke. So save your pennies, kids. Four of his most famous concertos are the Four Seasons, which I'm sure you've heard. And these concertos are structured like regular concertos. Each of those seasons is a concerto. All right, so spring is a concerto, summer is a concerto, fall, autumn is a concerto, winter is a concerto. And the way they're structured, if you listen to one of them straight through, which I'd like you to choose at least one of them to listen to all the way through. Although I'd encourage you to listen to the whole set because it's just amazing. But you're going to hear each one starts with a fast movement, and then there's a slow middle section, and then there's a fast ending. All of them are structured like this, and this is standard form for concertos at this time. You'll also hear a little bit of what's called ritornello form. What that means, ritornello literally is Italian for return. So you'll hear a kind of theme-like section that the orchestra plays, and then the soloist will play, and then you'll return to the theme. That's the ritornello. You'll hear a little bit of that in some of these movements. The other thing that I should point out to you is because when Vivaldi published this, he published the poetry with it, which was kind of unusual. Usually you just publish the music and ta-da. But he published poems with it because each of these concertos he felt had a very specific meaning or was trying to portray something very specific. So you could argue, and there's an author that makes this argument, that this could be considered an early form of program music or programmatic music, which is this idea that a song represents a very specific story or sound. So this is going to be a really short lecture today because I want you to listen to one of the movements from this in its entirety. My personal favorite is Winter. You can choose to listen to whichever of them you want, and I'd encourage you to listen to excerpts of all four of them, but listen to one in its entirety and see if you hear any evidence in any of them of ritornello, and whichever one you choose to listen to in full, listen for the fast start, the slow middle section, and the fast ending section. So take a listen, and then I just have one more really quick slide for you. All right, so this last slide, this is just to sum up some of the composers you could choose a song from for your selection for your concert from the Baroque era. These are all ones except for Handel and Bach that we've discussed already. So we talked about Dietrich Buxtehude. He was the German organ composer. We talked about Giacomo Carissimi. We talked about Jean-Baptiste Lully, who was the French composer that worked for Louis XIV. We talked about Johann Pachelbel really briefly in his Canon in D. We talked about Henry Purcell, English composer. We talked about Heinrich Schütz. We talked about today Antonio Vivaldi, and next week we'll talk about Bach and Handel. So pick out either today or next Monday when we do the last lecture from the Baroque era. Pick out one song from this era that you're going to include on your program and start typing that up. All right, guys, enjoy the listening, and I'll see you next week.